A few months ago, I started leveling my third ever World of Warcraft character, which was of course my Druid, and recently I just hit level 60 with it, and got to take on my first ever raid as a Druid, which went fine, but regardless, it was a lot of fun, and I want to take my Druid even further. I want to start raiding every week, get the best gear I possibly can, min-max everything possible, and top the DPS meter. Okay, that might not happen. Or will it? Week 1 begins pretty much exactly where the last Druid video ended. We are currently in Winterspring, heading up to the isolated Blood Elf looking to get attuned for Onyxia. My question is, how the hell did someone figure out that this was here before Questy existed? But after 15 minutes of attempting this stupid jump, we finally get to accept the final quest in the questling, and it's a pretty simple one. Head into Upper Blackrock Spire and slay the final boss of the dungeon. So I hearthed my way back to Stormwind and began flying up to the Burning Steps. Now granted, it did take a little while for me to get a group and for us to begin, but there's actually more than one thing that we have to do in Upper Blackrock Spire, because if you remember in the last video, I farmed this dungeon countless times in attempt to get the True Strike Shoulders. Now these things are crazy for us, because we need a total of 9% hit to get hit capped. Now I would be willing to sacrifice a little bit of hit percent if there was something else with insane stats on it. Currently, there is literally nothing else good enough for us, so these would be best at least until phase 5. We took the first few minutes of the run to clear out all of the rooms until we get into the first boss's room. Now luckily for us, this is the boss that actually drops our shoulders, so it would be pretty easy for us to farm later on. But we clear out the wave of ads that spawn and patiently wait for the boss to activate. We can then DPS him down relatively quickly and nothing. Guess we will just have to come back later on. But we continue on in the dungeon until we get to the rare boss Jed Runewatcher, who can drop some pretty nice caster loot, but sadly no Briarwood Reed, we only got the wand. Eventually, we get to Rend Blackhand, a pretty popular boss to farm since he drops a large amount of good loot. He's also incredibly annoying because before you can start to kill him, you've got to sit for 15 minutes killing waves and waves of mobs. But eventually, Rend comes out riding on his dragon and we can DPS him down. And 3 items dropped, none of which are particularly useful, at least to my knowledge anyway. We then move on to doing one of my favourite bosses called the Beast. Something about this boss I just find so cool. But next phase we might actually end up having to farm this boss since Ferocious Bite 5 becomes available. And if it's over 1,000 gold, there is no way I am going to pay that much. But after the Beast, we can move on to the final boss of the dungeon, General Dracasath, which is also the boss that we need in order to complete the attunement. And most players like to take him down in a bit of a weird way. Hunter will kite the boss out of the room whilst the rest of the party DPS down the ads. But unfortunately, I ended up getting one shot by the ads. But luckily, my group did successfully complete the fight and we can loot our quest item. And all that was left to do now is return to Winterspring and turn in the quest. And that's it, we are now attuned for Onyxia's lair. Now with the excitement of getting attuned, I decided to just jump straight into an Onyxia run, because why waste any time, right? So Onyxia is a pretty unique raid, since it's just one large boss that has more mechanics the entirety of Molten Core, which is 3. Now there's also not a massive amount of loot for us to obtain here, since we are playing Feral, and Feral is completely forgotten about until phase 5. But what we are going after is the head of Onyxia, since it starts a quest that offers a fantastic neck piece. It's not the best neck piece, since the best comes from the Farian, but given my loot luck, I don't think we will be getting it anytime soon. But we managed to clear up the first phase relatively cleanly, and that's when she flies up into the air and phase 2 begins. And it's a pretty boring part of the raid. We simply need to stand spread out from the other players due to the fireball mechanic, and let the ranged DPS do their thing. And eventually, she returns to her feet and phase 3 begins, which is basically the same as phase 1, where all we need to do is stay clear of her tail. However, in phase 3, whelps will spawn and she does gain a fear ability. And I actually just found out, like right now, that in phase 3, the cracks in the rocks now do damage. Genuinely had no idea. But we actually managed to get Onyxia down with everyone alive, which is pretty rare. And we can start to roll out the loot. Then the head of Onyxia is called out to roll, and I didn't realize just how many people had soft reserved the head. And well, I managed to get a pathetic 53 roll. So, lesson learned for the future. Pay attention to how many people have SR'd something. Now, the other thing that I started doing recently was participating in world bosses. Specifically, I wanted the NMD bosses, which I believe means Lethen, Emerus, Terror, and Ysondra. Now, they all have some unique items for each boss. However, there are also some items that can be dropped by any of those bosses. And what we are after is the Hammer of Bestial Fury. 154 attack power whilst in cat form is ridiculous. Now, unfortunately, it was a little bit late in the day and we were unable to find enough players. I mean, we had enough to kill the boss, but there was another alliance coalition here, and I believe what they did was dragged all of the trash mobs into us to wipe us. And after that, sadly, we had to give up on the kill since they had triple the amount of players that we did. Afterwards, I returned to UBRS because I still needed to get my shoulders. And I know I said it would be easy to farm since it's from the first boss, but the reality is it's actually quite difficult because 4 months ago, everyone was doing rend runs, which were runs that would only go up to the boss Rend Blackhand because they wanted to farm loot. But nowadays, people are really only going for the quests, which most of the time would be full runs. And full runs usually take about an hour each to complete. And I mean, I could leave, but then I would feel like I was being a dick. And well, first run, we only got the crappy cape. And of course, I didn't just do one run, I went back in for another run. And well, once again, we get nothing. But we get to run number 3 and we get nothing. Run number 4, also nothing. Now at this point, I was really starting to get quite frustrated because between last time and this time, we were up to something between 25 and 30 runs. To be honest, I wasn't really counting anymore. And each of those runs was taking about an hour to complete. So I decided to start hosting my own groups that were rend only runs and decided to tank them because I am an incredibly good tank. That was a lie. But our first run as a tank, do I even need to say it? We got nothing. But the second run, and I'm still annoyed at myself because I didn't hit record, but it does actually drop and we get the shoulders. And I was so unbelievably happy, I just couldn't describe it. Not happy because I got the loot, happy because I get to leave this dungeon and go do something else. In fact, we spent so long inside of UBRS that Onyxia had reset. So obviously, I wanted another go at getting my neck piece. And we cleared up phase 1 very cleanly and could now sit and wait for phase 3 to begin. And I actually did check this time, and if I remember correctly, it was 3 head SRs, which still isn't great, but I don't think we're gonna get any lower than that. But eventually, Onyxia drops back down to the ground and we can start to DPS her down again. And towards the end of the fight, we did actually start losing players, which is never great, but we got her down anyway and could start to roll on the loot. And then the head of Onyxia appears and we get that big fat 21 roll. And yeah, I was not very pleased, but unfortunately, that just happens sometimes. Tonight is raid night, and well, I had spent basically the entire day doing nothing. I was just sitting about waiting for the time to come. But eventually, we do receive our invite to the raid, and I started making my way up Blackrock Mountain and into Blackwing Lair, and we could get started with the first boss, Razorgore. Now, I still haven't done any research, although I'm starting to naturally understand the raid mechanics a bit more from just playing the game. But eventually, after 15 minutes of clearing out the eggs, Razorgore makes his way to the middle and we can start to DPS him down. And I gotta say, I'm definitely starting to feel more comfortable with playing cat. I mean, the DPS meter definitely doesn't show that, but I can feel it. And from this boss, my friend Lynn Farrow managed to get his useless Ret Paladin weapon. But then we move on to Veilistraz. Now, I think we can all come to an agreement that Veil is one of the most fun bosses, because so long as the tank has aggro, I'm pretty sure that's it for mechanics. But we all get like a buff or something that basically gives us infinite energy, allowing us to fully unleash everything. Still not top 10 DPS though. Now it does take a while, but eventually we get around to doing Broodlord Lash Layer. Now it's worth noting that I get 2 soft reserves, and I've thrown them into 2 items. Firstly, the Prester's Talisman of Connivery, which I recently learned would be best until TBC, so that would be absolutely massive to get. The second item is the Circle of Applied Force. It's nothing too special, but it's insanely massive stats, and you can't go wrong with that. Now after Broodlord, it's time for Firemaw, and this boss kinda scares me. It feels like he can one-shot me out of nowhere, so I always make sure to drop my stacks early. At least I think that's what you're supposed to do. Now we're making our way up to the next boss, and we get to these 3 big adds. And well, apparently, they have a mechanic that I was unaware of because I basically just blew up. Dying in classic raids always feels so much worse than in retail, because you make all these preparations with the likes of your world buffs just to explode to a random mob. But gotta admit, that only makes me feel more motivated to do better the following week. So the next 2 bosses are big ones. First being Ebonrock. Now this is a big one because of Drakefang Talisman. This trinket is so crazy that every single melee and hunter needs it. But unfortunately, the first drop is hard reserved for the tanks, which honestly is fair enough. But unfortunately, I was not alive for Ebonrock. But the trinket does drop, which honestly I'm happy about, because after 1 more drop, we can start to soft reserve it. But luckily, we get rezzed in time for Ebonrock's big brother Flamegore. Now, he's also a big one, because he can drop the Circle of Applied Force, but sadly, it did not drop. We then move on to Cro-Magus, and I quite enjoy him. He's a simple fight, an LOS mechanic, and he applies debuffs which you can dispel by eating sand. And lastly is Big Boy Nefarian. Again, quite a simple fight for us. All we need to do as a DPS is, well, DPS. And this is also where my beautiful neck comes from. But we get him down and it doesn't drop, which again is a bit disappointing that none of our items dropped. And it's not even about getting the item, just being able to roll on something is such a thrill. We then move into Molten Core. Now Molten Core in this stage of the game has become very easy. I mean, I understand most of the raid, which is definitely saying something. But in here we also get 2 soft reserves. And there's actually only 2 items in this raid that we even care about. The Bracers of Stability and the Band of Akuria. But I've actually used both of my soft reserves on the Band of Akuria, because it would be best until TBC. Well actually, it depends on the building consumables that you're using, but high chance I'll be using it until TBC. Now whilst the Bracers of Stability would be a nice upgrade right now, I'm going to be replacing it in the near future anyway, so there's really just no point in soft reserving it. So we spent a good while decimating every boss in our path until we get to Baron Geddon, where Braces of Stability were actually being rolled out, and I didn't notice and ended up missing on the roll, because we got a Thunder Fury binding. My first time seeing one of these things in person, and I was honoured to witness such an event. But with that excitement out of the way, we decimate a few more bosses until we get to the final boss, Ragnaros, where I am actually standing in the right place this time, after being corrected of course. But this is the boss where our Band of Akuria comes from, and well, we DPS him down, and after a couple of minutes Ragnaros dies, and sadly, no ring dropped. So no items we wanted dropped, but you know what, there's always next week. Week 2 begins inside of Alterac Valley. Now, I know I said I wasn't going to rank on my Druid because the first time I did it on my Warrior was just so horrible and depressing, but I just couldn't resist those legs because they are best all the way until Nax. Plus, the other pieces would go very nicely until AQ comes out, because I was still using gear like these Shade Feed boots, and obviously these things are crap, so some easy upgrades would be nice. Now this isn't actually the first week of my farming spree. I've actually been spamming AV for quite a few weeks now, but this is the first week of pure pain, because after this we can get rank 11, which means I need to farm 500,000 honor this week and then do that for 1 more week, and we would be rank 12 and would be able to purchase that sweet ranking gear. Now somewhere between all of the Alterac Valley spam, I took a break for some more Onyxia. and this time it was a comfortable 20 player run, which obviously increases our chances of getting the head. But just like every other Onyxia run so far, we clear up phase 1 nice and cleanly, and then patiently waited for phase 2 to be over. Then Onyxia returns to the ground and we can start to DPS her down. Now unfortunately towards the end of the run, I actually ended up dying along with quite a few other people, and I think this was my first time ever dying to Onyxia. But in the end, the group managed to get her down and we started to roll out on the loot. And well, head of Onyxia goes up and I roll a 27. Now once again, Ysondra decided to spawn, and I wanted to get that hammer. And luckily this time, we did have almost a full raid. And I did do what I think was right, which was to kill all of these spirits that spawned. And apart from that, I really have no idea what else I was doing. But towards the end, we had a lot of people dead. And somehow, I'm one of the few that's still alive. How that's even possible, I have no idea. But as far as the loot goes, unfortunately, we did not see the hammer drop. And it wouldn't be too long after this boss kill that we grouped up again to take down another. And we were chilling since it looked like there was no one else around until some people started to notice a few loose horde players running around. And that's when possibly the most cinematic thing I have ever seen in WoW happened. An entire horde raid charges over the hill unexpectedly. Unfortunately, they did wipe us and we had to give up. But it was so cool, I couldn't even be mad at that. So the other exciting thing that happened this week was the Midsummer event, which would allow players to obtain a couple of different buffs and complete a few quests. Now these quests were quite fun to do. We had to run around the entire world of Azeroth and click on bonfires, and doing this would allow us to obtain a few notable items, like the Fire Toasted Bun, which is a very solid buff item, and the Burning Blossoms, which I believe would allow you to put another buff onto yourself. Now these weren't particularly difficult or interesting quests, but I can't lie, it was nice to just run around the entire world clicking bonfires, because since I hit level 60 on this character, I'm not really exploring around the world much, so this was a very nice and welcomed change. Week 2's raid day came around quite quickly, and week 2 was quite a bit less eventful than week 1, which was due to the massive amount of Alterac Valley that I had to do. And thanks again to Cursed Cookie for enchanting all of my weapons again. But we actually got started pretty on time this week, and of course we start with Razor Gore. Now turns out, in our raid, Band of Akuria is priority for rogues and ferals, and it just so happens that none of the rogues had soft reserved it, meaning if Band of Akuria dropped, it was automatically handed to me, which really only got me more excited for Molten Core. And well, once again, I was feeling a lot more comfortable with playing Cat, but this time the DPS meter shows that, and by the end of the fight, I was 6th DPS, and I know for some people that doesn't mean a lot, but for me, that's huge, and that's one of the best parts of raiding. Being able to see yourself improve as the weeks go on. We then move on to killing Vale, and as fun as the fight is, we sadly went back to our rightful spot at the bottom of the DPS meter. We then move on to Broodlord Lash Lair. Also, for the soft reserves this week, we once again have soft reserved the Talisman of Connivery and Circle of Applied Force, but we were able to take down Broodlord and Firemaw with relative ease. And then we started moving up to Ebonrock again, and well, this is where I exploded last week, and I managed to survive the first mob, but then we exploded again. Turns out it has something to do with the person tanking the mob, and when they start spinning, I suppose I'm supposed to back up a bit. So as disappointing as it is, I'll just have to keep that in mind for next week. So we move on to Ebonrock, and without my world buffs, my pathetic DPS becomes even more pathetic. But sadly this week there was no Drakefan Talisman drop. Next up is of course Flame Gore, the boss that can drop our ring. But, yep, it did not drop. We then move on to killing Chromagus, and again, a simple fight, but we take him down nice and easily. And lastly is of course Nefarian, and I can't describe just how excited I get every time we fight this boss, knowing that one of my biggest pieces of gear could drop right now. But again, you know how my luck is. Now, although nothing dropped for us in Blackwing Lair, at least we still had the chance to get Band of Akuria, which, remember, would automatically go to me instead of anyone else so long as I had at least one SR on the ring. So that's what I did. I threw my first soft reserve into Akuria and the second soft reserve into Bracers of Stability, just because why not? Unfortunately this week we did not get a Baron Geddon binding. I mean, that would just be too insane if we got it 2 weeks in a row, but we clear through the entire raid with basically no deaths until we get to Ragnaros, where I finally remembered where to stand. And well, I was very excited. I couldn't wait to open up that loot window and see my ring. So we DPS him down, and I take a look at the loot, and what do I see? Band of Akuria. I was so unbelievably happy. This was my first real piece of raid loot in WoW Classic. Well, technically, since I wouldn't count my Draconic Maul because I don't actually use that as my weapon in raid. Point is, I was extremely happy. Week 3 begins inside of Stranglethorn Vale, because I was on my way to Zul'Gurub Island, so that I could turn any quest that I had completed several weeks ago, and that was so that I could get the Belt of Preserved Heads, a belt piece that would be bis for me, at least for now anyway. And well, I actually ended up getting attacked by a couple of mages, so I did what any good player would do, and ran away, and by doing so, I was able to turn in my quest. So, no reason to go back. Now, this was also the final week that I had to spend in Alterac Valley. 500,000 more honor, and we would be free. And by this point, Onyxia had obviously reset, so I went in again for yet another chance at getting the neck piece, and it was the exact same as all the other ones. Clean up phase 1, sit and wait for phase 2 to be over, then DPS her down. And it did take a while, but eventually we got to rolling out the head, and I managed to hit a 59 roll. And looking at all the other rolls, I was excited. I thought that this was finally the run that I had something to replace my old crappy neck. That was until 2 other people rolled higher. Now luckily for me, Onyxia reset the very next day, so of course I went straight back in. We clean up phase 1, sit and wait for phase 2 to be over, and then DPS her down in phase 3. And I patiently waited for the head to be called, and then rolled a 16. I think I might actually be the best worst roller in the history of World of Warcraft. Now unfortunately, that was all the excitement for the week. So moving on to raid day, we're actually starting off at Firemaw because I forgot to hit record, which I'm quite impressed with because it's actually been quite a while since I did that. And really, my only goal for this raid is to not die. Since my luck with loot has been so bad, I'm not even expecting it anymore. We take down Firemaw and begin making our way over to Ebonrock, where once again, we come face to face with my arch nemesis. So what did I do? Well, I sat back and watched until they were almost dead. And would you believe I actually survived? Amazing how the trash mobs are more scary than the bosses themselves. But we move on to killing Ebonrock. Again, this is the boss that can drop that amazing Drake Fang talisman. And what do you know? It actually does drop. Which means as of next week, we can now start to soft reserve it, which I cannot wait for. Next up is of course Flamegore, who did actually drop the Circle of Applied Force. Finally, a piece of loot from Blackwing Lair that I can actually roll on. So needless to say, I was quite excited about that. But we clear up Chromagus and then move on to Nefarian. Now the loot in this specific raid had been so good, I just thought that there's no way that anything else of significance could drop. But when we did kill him, I was amazed to see that he dropped the talisman. I was so excited that I could now at least roll on 2 massive upgrades. And well, we were making our way over to Molten Core and the Circle of Applied Force gets called to roll and I roll a 19. In the past 3 weeks, how many times had I rolled over 20? Genuinely must be one of the most unlucky players to exist. But of course it's not done yet because we still have the talisman to roll on. And it gets called up and there is a lot of people who have soft reserved the item. And well, I did slash roll and I got a 92 roll. I was very excited and I stared down at the rest of the rolls, begging that no one gets higher, and I win the roll. Genuinely, don't think I have been happier. The feeling I got when I won that roll was insane. All those terrible rolls over the past few weeks led up to me getting the biggest item possible. And in the end, all of that suffering was worth it. Okay, so the original plan for this video was to have 4 full weeks of playing Druid, but it hasn't quite turned out that way, because by the time I'm able to record raiding again, then get it all edited together, etc, phase 5 will already be here. But from what I started recording, basically, I ran out of manual crowd pummelers, so I spent some time farming those. And this week was the week that I finally hit rank 12, and could purchase my beautiful best in slot legs, as well as some other nice things to go along with it. And well, depending on how my next raid goes, you might just end up seeing it in the next video. I hope you all enjoyed today's video because I enjoyed making it. Lads, I need a favor. I need to know what you thought of this video, because if you like this kind of end game video, then maybe, just maybe, we can start to do an end game video monthly. Because to be honest, I really did have a lot of fun making this video. I love sharing with you guys the adventures and experiences that I have in Azeroth, and this is just another great way for me to do that. As of content coming, Phase 5 is obviously coming out tomorrow. Well, if you're watching this day of release, then it's tomorrow. So I'm more than likely going to spend the next little while recording stuff based around that. And of course, we will continue the Undead Rogue journey very, very soon as well. Anyway, I think that's enough yapping for today. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will see you all later.